Rabbi Reines just read for us the story of Babel, Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, if you want to follow along again. The story begins, Kol ha'aretz sefa echat udevarim achadim. All the world had the same language and the same utterances. Is this healthy, we should ask? The same sefa language is one thing, but they also have the same divarim. The Hebrew word divarim can be translated as words, discourses, speeches, or utterances. We refer to the Ten Commandments as aseret hadevarim. How can the world have an absolutely singular voice? Is this story about unity or compelled uniformity? We read that all the people of the world migrate to a valley and settle down together. They start to build a city with a tower at its center. Some commentators say that Babel built a great tower to try to reach God, but if the goal were maximal height, why build in a valley? Rather, I think they act out of fear. They suppose they have to build a great fortified city. Pen nafutz al panei chul haaretz, lest we be dispersed across the whole world. Remember what immediately precedes the story of Babel, the flood that wipes out almost all of humanity, so we can understand why the following generations may be skittish, why they would want a city with impenetrable walls, a city that can withstand any external attack and shut down any internal dissent. God sees what's happening. And God says, if this is how the people with identical speech have begun to act, then nothing they plot will be beyond them. The text doesn't tell us what exactly troubles God. We readers are left to fill in the blanks. Maybe God fears what this people with their uniform utterances might do to each other, that this people that so clings to their ideological homogeneity is stifling nonconformist voices. So God confounds the people's speech and scatters them across the earth. And then, vayachtelu livnot ha'ir, they stopped building the city. God does not destroy the city. God does not force the people to stop building. God merely introduces diversity of language. Now, a person is forced to ask her fellow, what do you mean? Can you help me understand you? What do you believe? And what do you want? Babel is a cautionary tale. A society that speaks with a singular voice is reason for divine concern. The lesson of Babel rings out this Shabbat on the eve of an election. If we do not protect free speech, the great democratic experiment of the United States will not survive either. Our country protects free speech not because the spittle of hate-fueled bigots has any value, but because the position in which they stand, often on the outskirts of society, is an arena of voices we cannot risk stifling. It is where John Scopes stood, where Rosa Parks organized, Martin Luther King Jr. preached, the Freedom Riders rode, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward reported, Salman Rushdie and Judy Blume write. And as Jews know all too well, the arena of free speech is also where a lot of bigots dwell. A lot of free speech is ugly, sexist, racist, anti-Semitic. So time after time, we've tried to devise legal standards that ban odious speech while allowing for good speech. But again and again, we've found that limits to speech in the name of blasphemy, obscenity, vulgarity, sanitary nuisance, even attempts to curtail hate speech, as well-intentioned as they may have been, also stifle the brave, invigorating, necessary speech that pushes our country forward. We simply cannot have the good free speech without the bad. Of course, there are limits to allowable speech, the person who cries fire in the movie theater, but discomfort is not injury, and bigotry is not incitement. Liberal tolerance is a constant exercise in restraint and humility. We protect the arena of free speech, even though doing so protects the rights of people to say brutish, terrible things. If we want democracy, and my God, I do, we have no option. Jews know this truth. History has made it clear that any political agenda that removes protections for diverse thought will not serve us well. Illiberalism never makes Jews safer. Any movement to restrict free expression will ultimately target us. As Jews, we must take it seriously when a presidential candidate repeatedly attacks journalists as enemies, pledges to jail reporters who refuse to reveal their sources, and complains that television networks should be stripped of their broadcast licenses. As Jews, we should watch carefully what's happening in Florida with Amendment 4, a ballot initiative restoring a woman's right to an abortion. Florida launched a taxpayer-funded campaign opposing the amendment. That's not my American values in action, but I don't think it's an attack on democracy either. That came last month, when the Florida Department of Health threatened to criminally prosecute TV stations that aired ads for Amendment 4. Let's be clear about what this was: a state attempting political censorship. Thankfully, a district judge issued a temporary restraining order, now extended, forbidding Florida from continuing to threaten news outlets. Erosion of free speech begins in the cultural realm. Billionaire newspaper owners ending decades-long practices of editorial board political endorsements, or the removal of books from children's classrooms, or novel internet-age legal issues, big tech companies with platforms so large they could be considered a form of public space censoring speech. While these forms of censorship may not always rise to the level of actionable constitutional violation, the illiberal trend is chilling and insidious. We need a culture of free speech to undergird the First Amendment. As illustrated in our parsha this week, the story of Babel following on the heels of the flood, censorship stems from fear. Fears of division led Babel to insist that their city have divarim achadim, uniform utterances. When we are that afraid, we will abandon our core commitments for the illusion of security. Fear makes us illiberal. Right now, many Jews are afraid for good reason. Over the past year, anti-Semitism and Jew hatred have risen. Many of us have felt betrayed by those we thought were our political allies and personal friends. Many of us are terrified of what will come next for Jews, America, and Israel. We are tempted to build walls, interrogate others' motives, and use the force of law to shut opposition down. And I get it. When I read about prejudices spewed about Jews and Zionists, or some elected officials' degrading comments about women's reproductive choices, or lie-filled curricula marketed to homeschooling parents, my instinct screams, "Don't let them say that. Punish them." And I can feel that anti-democratic impulse bubbling up within me and threaten to consume me. Jewish tradition understands that fear can lead us to do dangerous things. Al tirah, do not fear, is repeated in Torah so often that Maimonides counts it as among the 613 mitzvot. When we are afraid, we risk seeking protection from authoritarian strongmen, people we may think are great, but we know are not good. On Tuesday, our nation will vote for our next leadership. I pray that we will elect leaders who, whatever their other political beliefs, are committed to democracy and the freedoms that it requires. On the eve of the 1916 presidential election, Rabbi Samuel Shulman gave an extraordinary sermon. The title, Before the Ark of the American Covenant. Like the high priest who entered the Holy of Holies once a year, Shulman declared, every American citizen is called to perform a priestly function once a year. As he enters the voting booth, Shulman wrote, and withdraws himself from the clamor of the campaign and indulges in silent, conscientious meditation upon his duty, he becomes conscious of the American covenant. Voting is a duty we must treat with utmost sanctity. It is an obligation of the covenant of citizenship. Shulman, an immigrant to this country, loved America fiercely, and his patriotism was religious. He loved America and he believed in America, in its protection of individual rights, civic equality, and the strength and goodness of its institutions. On another occasion, Shulman would declare that America is, in my humble opinion, the crown of the whole development of what began at Sinai and was perfected in Jerusalem. I don't know how many of us would go that far. Shulman's unwavering love of America might feel quaint, idealistic, even naive. But I suspect that even Shulman, in his heart of hearts, had some doubts. After all, the Torah talks about Shabbat with such frequency because the people kept neglecting its observance. The prophets continually decry idolatry because Israel kept falling short of monotheism. And perhaps Shulman kept preaching about American liberal democracy because he knew that it too was fragile. Perhaps he sensed that if we don't cherish democracy, we will lose it. John Adams wrote in a letter, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." America's democracy isn't divinely ordained or guaranteed by God. Democracy withers from inattention, and yes, it dies in darkness. I suspect that's because the liberal tolerance democracy requires doesn't come naturally to us humans. We need to keep working at it. Last year, Ian and I went to Big Bend National Park for our honeymoon. We got some funny looks when we mentioned that we were honeymooning in Southwest Texas, including, I must say, from some of you, but it was perfect. We found that the sky really is bigger in Texas. We learned about different types of cacti. I bought an enormous handmade quilt, really classic Americana, which Ian hates. We drove hundreds of miles, passing through the Chisos Mountains and canyons. We ate fajitas. We hiked along the Rio Grande, the river that serves as a natural barrier for about 1,200 miles of the US-Mexico border. Distances were vast. Hundreds of miles between gas stations, people living hours away from hospitals. I asked a lot of questions. Where kids go to school, what folks do with trash, what happens when a house catches fire, where people buy groceries. The remoteness was like nothing I had ever experienced. The land was desolate and inhospitable, arresting, majestic, but a hard, hard place to live. The trip filled me with awe at the jaw-dropping beauty and staggering diversity of my country. It reaffirmed that being an American citizen is one of the great blessings of my life. I love my country. I have never felt that patriotism belongs only to the most hateful and jingoistic of my co-citizens. I love NASA and peanut butter, our national park system and the USPS, bodegas and Broadway, American optimism, and the way that our Navy protects global shipping lanes from piracy for all the world's benefit. I love peach pie. Most of all, I love liberal democracy with all that it entails. tolerance, individual rights, civic equality, honest elections, the United States' extraordinary legacy of free association, free religion, free speech. We Americans have vastly different preferences for how to live, from city apartments with supers and drawers full of takeout menus to rural ranches miles away from the nearest neighbor. We are acutely aware of our national diversity, and we should be proud of it too. God didn't destroy the city of Babel. The project remained standing, unfinished. Maybe the people still could have built their great nation if they were willing to return to the work and talk through their newly undeniable differences. But once they were forced to acknowledge their diversity, they abandoned the project. We have an opportunity to do better. We have the chance to build something both great and good. On Tuesday, many of us will stand at the Ark of the American Covenant. May we treat that responsibility with the solemnity that it deserves. May we, in the greatness and messiness of our diversity, reject Babel's imposed groupthink. May our votes come from a place of conviction and love. What an honor it is to be part of the great project, nearly 250 years old, to form a more perfect union. Shabbat Shalom.